Hey there, it's Silver. This is Kingsgrave. So this is heavily inspired by the old school 2D Zelda games, or at least that's the sort of idea, that's what the page mentions, and I do see what they're talking about when they mention inspirations like that, but really mechanically and structurally, it's almost nothing like those at all. This game is actually much more of a puzzle game than anything else, which may seem kind of strange looking at it, but I swear it's true. So the idea is you are a king, and you awake in the sort of grave of your previous kingdom, where a horrible disease has swept through and murdered just about everyone, and everything is in ruins. And you don't know why you've been revived, or why you're here, or really the nature of the disease or anything like that. You're just kind of here again, and you got to figure it all out. And your job is to restore your kingdom, to explore this chain of islands that your kingdom originally sat on, get some survivors back under your command, and sort of rebuild. And the reason I say it's much more of a puzzle game than anything else, even though it does have like some action RPG elements and some other stuff like that, is because of the structure of the game. You are in this place that you know basically nothing about, and you only have a certain number of directions that you can feasibly go, but you won't know that at first, because this is taking some classic Zelda, Metroidvania-ish cues, and so you have a pretty large world to explore, but a lot of it will be blocked off by certain things you don't have yet, or certain weapons you don't possess yet, or things like that. So you're encouraged to explore around in every direction you can until you find the ways that you can actually complete. And by completing those directions, you'll gain some new resources, maybe a new tool or a new weapon or something, and that will unlock more areas, and you'll keep doing this, sort of exploring outward from the center to restore as much of your kingdom as possible. And as you would expect, you start out with a very basic set of stuff, and you've got to find the rest, or you craft the rest, depending on what you're talking about. So you'll have just yourself, a small health gauge, and a single weapon, which in this case is your kingly scepter, that you mostly just bonk things with. It does very little damage at first, but it can be upgraded. But you will find that the stick bonk is just fine to harvest some basic resources, because there will be lots of like barrels and chests and things around that you can break, and breaking these will give you stuff like wood and stone and scrap metal and just sort of really basic building block kind of stuff. And once you have a good amount of resources, you'll notice that there are these signs all over the place and these destroyed buildings. And you can walk up to the signs, and it will tell you what the building is and what will happen if you restore it, as well as what resources you need to actually construct it. And these are going to be what your main sort of marks of progress are, finding all these various signs to reconstruct all the various buildings on these islands. You'll also come across some survivors, like I mentioned, because you do need people to staff all these buildings. So you've got to come across encampments, just single people chilling out on some horrible place somewhere, whatever. You'll come across all sorts of different people, and you can rescue them. And they will be shown in the top of the screen there as the total number you have rescued of your entire kingdom, and then the number that you currently have available to you to assign to tasks. And in order to actually restore all these buildings and things, you will need to dedicate some people to actually run them. And as you're exploring, you'll also notice that there are lots of monsters in this kingdom now, and they all drop this sort of life essence resource. This is important to how the sort of progression works a little bit later, because monsters actually respawn. It's all tied to the way that clearing the world works. So most of the islands will have this torch on them, and it'll have a red skull on it with a number that shows you how many monsters are on that island. And once you clear out those monsters, the torch will light. It'll become a fast travelable point on your map, and any of the buildings on that island will then become available to be messed with or purchased or crafted or whatever you need to do. You can't do any of that stuff until you clear the monsters out. However, there are some areas that will always have monsters on them. They're not places that you can fully clear out. Monsters there will respawn. And you need this because there are a lot of different places where you can trade that essence, that life stuff that you get from killing monsters, for various resources. And that's because all these barrels and crates and things that you'll be breaking at first to get some basic wood and stone materials, they don't come back. So once you've broken them, they're gone. And then once you've spent those resources, then those resources are gone. So you need these buildings that are effectively production buildings that allow you get sort of like a lump sum of that resource when you build one. And also it allows you to spend various amounts of the life essence to actually get that resource in certain numbers. Generally, it's like 1, 5, and 10 of a given resource, and you can spend like 3, 15, or 30 essence in order to get that many. So you'll quickly need to start finding and constructing these buildings that produce resources like this, because all the stuff that's in the world doesn't respawn except for the enemies. And since these buildings use the resource that you get from the enemies as fuel, then that means you can have an unlimited supply of these building blocks. But in addition to all the production stuff, you'll also be finding lots of things that enhance your skills in some way. So early on you can find a dash, for instance. You don't start with it, but it is very useful to have once you do get it. It does not give you immunity frames, I don't think, but it does move you quite fast in whatever direction you press, so it's useful in combat. You'll also find some stuff like an expansion to how long the dash actually lasts, so it makes you travel farther, or a second dash so that you can hold 2 charges at once. You'll also find these shrines that give you more maximum health and slowly increment your health gauge. And then there's all the other things that you'll be needing, like for instance the weapons. There are actually 4 different weapons that you can have in your main weapon slot. There's the scepter, an axe, a sword, and a spear, and they're all good for different things. They also all will eventually get upgrades once you build this forge, and they each have their own set of upgrades and the ability to take on different damage types and stuff, so they become quite powerful later on, but at first you'll find that when you first get a weapon, it's not all that strong. The weapons also act as keys in certain areas because there will be these blocks that can have a weapon symbol on them, and you need to smack a switch with the appropriate weapon in order to get that symbol to appear on the block, and then you can use that block to hold down a switch that has the same symbol on it. So there will be certain doors or gates that are guarded by symbols of weapons that you need to get past them. There's also a bow, which is relatively useful in combat, but honestly most of its usage is out of combat for like puzzle solving and stuff, because there will be things like switches you can't physically reach, so you have to shoot them from a distance to activate them, or certain things that require a certain damage type, like electrical switches that don't have an obvious way of triggering them, but you can eventually get electrical arrows so that you can actually trigger those things remotely. Even the shield you can get has a sort of puzzle or traversal function because it does act as a shield like you would expect, but it also, there are these harpoon guns that you can hold up your shield in front of, and then they'll shoot a harpoon into it and pull you across gaps and stuff. So a lot of what you're going to be doing in the game is wandering, just sort of exploring and seeing what is in every given direction, because it's a very open game. There's a lot of ways to go from the start, and then eventually you're going to run into some sort of block or gap you can't cross, or a machine you can't interact with, or something like that, and you got to remember that that's there, and then explore in every direction until you find the stuff you can currently do. And chances are once you do some of that stuff, it will reward you with some resources that allow you to build a new building that gives you a tool you didn't have previously, and that will open up new spots and things like that. So you're just gradually expanding this map, mostly by gathering resources and building constructions to help you get new shiny stuff. Eventually you'll also reach a bit of a more advanced part where you have to get these mines and then go build them first, and then go into the mines and gather various ores and gems and stuff, and you can buy these smelters to smelt those ores and some coal into bars, and then use those bars for other upgrades or for purchasing things like the sword. There's also a magic spell that you get access to. It starts out as like a sort of holy hand grenade style of thing, but you can upgrade it in a couple of different directions, either to be just a very powerful single target projectile or a sort of AoE centered on you, which is the one I chose. And this is important because there are lots of enemy types in this game, quite a few actually, and they tend to be weak to only one specific thing, so you got to figure out what that is. And in fact, there are some enemy types that take absolutely no damage whatsoever from anything they're not weak to. Some of them just take less damage, but some are basically immune, like these shadow creatures that you can find. All of your weapons at first will just pass right through them. You can't hurt them at all, and they're quite damaging to you, so you've got to stay away from them. But once you start getting things with light damage, like your sword, your scepter upgrade, or the magic spell, then you can actually start damaging them back. And that's the main loop, although you will occasionally find things that shake this up, like the big enemy spawning flesh pit things that you have to find an oil refinery and actually make barrels of oil, cover them in oil, and then find a way to set them on fire in order to destroy them, so they're like little puzzle encounters. And you'll also sometimes come across these large enemy encounters that usually it's like a big open arena with a bunch of like bones and stuff in the middle, and once you walk in there you'll get locked in place, and then a whole bunch of enemies will start to spawn. These are usually like 3 or 4 waves of enemies long, and they get very difficult, but if you pass them, usually it gives you access to some pretty significant new areas. Large amounts of the map are often gated behind these, so they're important to do. And there are lots of other smaller puzzles that you can just happen across, which is always cool. So you'll sometimes find like a bunch of switches, and once you start messing around with them, you'll see that they move these doors in different amounts, so you've got to find out the right position to put all the switches in to move all the doors correctly to open a new area up. Or maybe you'll find a sort of broken electrical way, and you'll have to reassemble the sort of diode bits and get the lightning to travel along a specific path to unlock a certain door, and things like that. You'll just sort of happen across little puzzles to do, environmental puzzles. And I think overall that this is a pretty good structure. I think the game has a solid set of ideas and some pretty enjoyable progression, because the entire game is basically about progressing slowly across these islands by unlocking new stuff. However, I do have a couple of issues with the way that it works. For one, the control feels weird. In this game, it's kind of hard to explain exactly how it feels without playing it, but it feels quite stiff, and I think a lot of this is because you only have like 4 directional movement a lot of the times, and you'll notice that I'm moving diagonally sometimes in the background, and I don't know how I'm doing that. It just happens sometimes. Sometimes it seems like you're locked to 4 directions, sometimes it seems like you can move in 8, and I don't know exactly why. I think it has to do with the difference between mouse and keyboard controls and controller controls, but honestly it shouldn't be that different in order to completely change how you move, so there's obviously something weird going on there. But my biggest issue with the game is honestly the combat. It's because I don't think I get it. I think I'm missing something with how this game's combat is supposed to work, because it seems like there's a huge amount of unavoidable damage in this game, and I don't know how to change that. It seems like a lot of the enemies, if they want to hit you, they're just gonna hit you, no matter what. There's like nothing you can do about it. A lot of the enemies attack faster than you can swing, and your dash does not have immunity frames, so you can't dash away from or through attacks. There are lots of enemies that are the type that rush you and explode when they get close to you, except in this game when you hit them, sometimes they explode instantly and do damage to you that you never could have done anything about. Other times they go through a little animation that shows you they're about to explode and gives you time to get away. And I don't know how it chooses which one it's doing. It doesn't seem to have any consistency at all. Sometimes they just blow up in your face and there's nothing you can do. Sometimes it gives you time. There are these sort of reddish tree stump looking enemies that I'm convinced that it's physically impossible to actually fight without taking damage, because they have a melee attack that comes out instantly, like faster than you can swing. It comes out immediately once you get in range, and you can't dodge it once it does swing, and they don't get interrupted when you swing at them, so they will always hit you with this attack, and you might think, well, use your bow or your spear, something to give you some range. Those don't do any damage to them is the problem. The only thing that damages them is the axe at first, and the axe is very slow. You can eventually get some better arrows, like some fire arrows, that will, I think, damage them, but by that time you've already had encountered them like many times, so you will still have to fight them without those upgrades. And that's kind of just the overall problem that I have with the combat system in this game. It feels messy. Because of the stiff controls and the fact that it feels like tons of enemies can just hit you whenever they want, it makes the combat feel unnecessarily frustrating. This is demonstrated by the way that the dash works best of all, I think, because the dash, like I mentioned, it doesn't give you immunity frames, so you can't dash through attacks with it. And because you sometimes are stuck to 4 directional movement, if you, say, are pointing your analog stick down and left, and an enemy is to your left, if you're pointing slightly further left than down, you'll dash straight to the left into the enemy, and you'll actually grab them and take them with you as you dash, like you're tackling them, but it doesn't hurt them. However, they'll be able to hurt you the entire time you're dashing. So very frequently I've found myself dying from actually taking enemies with me when I try to dash around them, because they still have collision for some reason and can actually get stuck on you. And then there's the fact that, unfortunately, the game is relatively buggy. I encountered a pretty severe bug in my playthrough where it acted like it reset my entire save, but didn't completely. Basically, when I loaded my save, it did the original cutscene that plays when you first start a game. It did it over again as if I was just starting, although I wasn't. I was like a couple hours in. And it kept all of my buildings that I had purchased, although they were shown as not being purchased on the map, so it didn't show them to me as if I hadn't bought them yet, but when I actually arrived there, I had. But the one thing it did reset was all of my survivors. I had to go back through the world over again and find all the people that I previously found that weren't working in places, because it sort of reset all of them. And this culminated in kind of a funny bug where one character is normally standing outside of his destroyed shop, and then when you fix the shop, he moves in front of it and will talk to you about it and give you a map and stuff. But because I had already fixed his shop, but it reset the world, it had 2 copies of him. It had the him standing sad in front of his shop and the him standing happy from his fixed shop at the same time, and they were right next to each other. So there's clearly some weird bugs when it comes to partially resetting your progress at random. That's definitely something you need to take a look at. Overall, I think I've decided that Kingsgrave is just not for me. It's not my kind of thing, which is a shame because I love the way that it looks. I love the atmosphere that it has, the sort of spooky nature of everything. It looks fantastic, and the music is really good too. It's just that the kind of messy combat and clunky feeling controls keep me from enjoying it as much as I'd hoped I would. I don't think that it's actually a bad game, but I do think it has some bugs that need to be worked out. But it is also less than $10, which means if you think you might enjoy a sort of puzzly action RPG experience like this, then you could do a lot worse than to at least give it a shot. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Kingsgrave if you wish to actually give it a look yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.